Welcome to Mystics and Muons. And today I've got Phil McLemore here. Did I say your last name right?
Yes.
Okay. And yeah, thanks for coming on, Phil. I appreciate it. I've been looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
I first, I think, listened to you. Actually, I was first introduced to you by a friend. I'd started getting into Sam Harris and the Waking Up app and more kind of atheist meditative path, and really Mormonism wasn't on my radar because I had left years before. And interestingly enough, I had a friend that was getting into these things. He was the one that actually recommended How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan for me to read, but he was still in the church at the time, and he was like, hey, you should read I think it was Becoming the Beloved. And so I read that and I was like, oh wow, like this is actually the same path, but people are doing it through Mormonism. And so it was an interesting kind of connect of two different pathways. And I listened to you and Bill Reel on episode. So yeah, why don't you give like maybe a quick summary of kind of a nutshell of paragraph of like where you're at now, and then we can dive more into your story, kind of where you ended up, where you're at.
Yeah, I was born in 1950, so it's easy to keep track of my age. Our family was Catholic. My mother sent me to Catholic schools, so I had a pretty rigorous primary and secondary education. And I assumed Catholicism was true. That's what they told me. That's what I knew. And I took it quite seriously. At some point in high school, and I was in an all-male Catholic high school, things just weren't making sense to me anymore. And I started thinking about my experience in Catholicism. There was when I was 10 years old, I was at a Boy Scout campout. And in those days, I don't know if they've changed it or not, but if you ate meat on Friday, that was considered to be a mortal sin. So in Catholicism, you had two kinds of sins, mortal and venial. Well, venial sins was like lying to your mother. Mortal sins typically were murder and rape, but eating meat got on the mortal list. And so here I was at 10, hungry at a Boy Scout campout on Friday night, no meat on Friday. And I succumbed to the temptation and ate a hot dog. And so I had committed a mortal sin, meaning if I died before confession and forgiveness and absolution by a priest, I would burn in hell for eternity. So needless to say, I didn't travel very far Saturday and Sunday. I just hunkered down in the house, didn't go anywhere, didn't cross any streets. And then on Monday afternoon, I went through in between houses and back roads to get up to the church to get into confession. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 3 weeks since my last confession. I ate a hot dog on Friday night, and so when he absolved me of that sin, I levitated out of there. I felt quite. But in hindsight, I'm thinking about that. Some poor 10-year-old eats a hot dog and he's going to burn in hell for eternity. My father died when I was age 7, and in Catholicism, people are they go to heaven, they go to purgatory, or they go to hell. And purgatory is this in-between place where probably most people go. And you can do things to get your loved ones out of purgatory, work for the dead. And so you could read holy cards and say a rosary and say prayers and light candles, and that would impute grace to the person stuck in purgatory, suffering for their sins until, their venial sins, until they're removed, and then they would go into heaven. Well, you could speed that up by doing things. And so I used to go into the church and to light a candle for my father. Our family was of modest means, and I could only light the 10-cent candle. I remember this rich kid coming in, and the candles were different sizes based on the money you paid. And so he would come in and light a $1 candle, right? Huge, and it would burn. And the longer the candle burned, the more grace was imputed to your loved one. And so I'm thinking, gosh, I've only got 10 cents. My father's going to suffer longer because I only have a dime and not a dollar. So that sort of thing began to trouble me. And then when I got into college at age 17, I just stopped going to church. It just wasn't nourishing me and it wasn't making sense. I spent 2 years from 17 to 19 really actively seeking religions and attending churches and going to tent meetings and exploring religion and Christianity as much as possible. And at age 19, I met a girl who had been a girlfriend. She converted to Mormonism, and then she began to work on me. And it was about a 10-month process before she got me in front of the missionaries. But for whatever reason, I was attracted.
Real quick on your childhood, like, and we can maybe talk about this later, but that's been one of the things that as I've like looked back and in therapy and coaching and, you know, processed childhood and processed my feelings, you know, with Mormonism, that's been one of the heaviest things is like connecting with my inner child and like having this grief for like just how much burden I, as like a 5, 6, 7-year-old, you know, carried about some of these things that religion puts on you. You know, these, I had an experience where, you know, pretty normal childhood, you know, normal little boy stuff of like exploring your private parts with a neighbor friend. And, you know, my mom had caught me and, you know, she was concerned and, you know, talked to me. But she couldn't quite get into my head. You know, she had her, you know, pretty chaotic childhood, but I remember just like holding this guilt and shame and, you know, moral sins, morality in Mormonism. This is the sin next to murder, and just like it's something I carried even into BYU of thinking like, oh, I need to disclose this, and like, was it before I was 8 years old, and like, was I accountable for it, and am I gay? And yeah, just it's been difficult to just realize like how much of like your childhood and innocence, the dark side of religion, I think, kind of takes from kids.
Yeah, it does. It does. Oddly, during this time of investigating, I had a hippie. Now, this is the 1960s, so I grew up during this, you know, this whole hippie phenomena. And there was this hippie girl named Lark that lived behind me, and she invited me over to meditate. And she took me into this room, and it was dark and black lights. I don't even know if people are familiar with black lights anymore, but she would turn on a black light and had all these psychedelic posters, and it's, you know, kind of a surreal experience. And she had this incense burning, and then she put me in lotus posture, which my legs really weren't designed to do. So after about 5 minutes of the weird light and the incense smoke, which was giving me a horrible headache, and my legs and hips and knees were in serious pain from lotus posture, I just got sick and almost threw up. So I said, Lark, I appreciate it. I got to get out of here. And I jumped up and ran off. And I came to the conclusion Buddhism isn't for me, which is kind of funny because I ended up, you know, going into a meditative tradition. But Mormonism at age 19 made sense to me. Its theology and philosophy seemed to be much more logical and comprehensible than what I was being exposed to in traditional Christianity. It really inspired me. It lifted me. It motivated me to live more maturely, more responsibly, more morally. And at that point in life, it really felt like a transformation, serious transformation. And it was, because it did alter the course of my life quite significantly. So anyway, the next year I went off, served a mission in Brazil. My mother moved to Florida when I was in Brazil. So when I came back, I went to school at the University of South Florida and was chosen to be the Latter-day Saints Student Association leader. Our program was so successful, I got noticed. And so when I graduated, I was invited to teach evening institute classes at the University of Florida when I went to graduate school there. And they liked my teaching so much that I got hired directly off the street to be a full-time CES, Church Educational System Director, Institute Director. And so I did that. I was the founding director at Auburn University in Alabama, and then I was the Institute Director at the University of Georgia. And for a variety of reasons, I left CES, and the church has very few people qualified to be a military chaplains. There are certain educational requirements that most Mormons don't meet. I got married late, age 27, for a Latter-day Saint. And I had been hanging out at the University of Florida taking graduate courses in religion and philosophy, and I just happened to have enough credits to qualify for the chaplain service. And the church was desperate to get somebody to fill a position they had been offered. So I took it. And so I served as an Air Force chaplain for 21 years. You do represent the church as you're doing that, but you serve as a general Christian chaplain in the military context. So it's a great experience. I mean, I had 21 years of being friends with and working intimately with virtually every mainline Protestant minister, non-denominational Christians, Jewish rabbis, Catholic priests. It was quite an education.
Now, at this point, did you, like, when you joined, and at this point, like, being a chaplain, like, were you of the mindset of, like, Mormonism is the one and only true church? Because it's been interesting. I've met some people that, as converts, they're like, well, I joined, but I didn't really buy that. I just thought, like, yeah, this was the path for my growth, and it had a lot of things that resonated, but I wasn't quite fully on board of, like, this is the way. So, which is very foreign to, like, me as, like, a very black and white believer. I was like, yeah, I took everything literally.
Yeah, no, I was in. I was a true believer. I did, at age 27, I did have a faith crisis, if you want to call it that. It was really plural marriage that stimulated that, and it traumatized me and troubled me for some time. I mean, it's just not plural marriage, it's the way it was carried out that's so disturbing. And one of the issues with Mormonism is, for many people, your sense of self, your personal identity becomes so enmeshed with Mormonism, you can't pull the two apart. And so if something comes up that's threatening about your faith in Mormonism, it's also threatening to your personal identity. It drives some people to thoughts of suicide. It's so serious. And so it motivated me to find the answers and make everything okay. So that's what I did. I spent hours and hours and hours studying the issues, finding answers or creating answers. And then I engaged proactively in studying all of the anti-Mormon material. I wanted to be proactive. I didn't want to be caught off guard with information. So by 1983, I was the church expert on anti-Mormon materials, which had gone from books to videos and audios and so forth. And I actually worked with church headquarters and a gentleman who later became a member of the First Presidency of the 70. I did a big 6-month project going through all of the issues that came up in anti-Mormon literature. So many people were leaving the church at that time from these materials. They wanted a way to address it. So they asked me to, and that's what I did. I did it with a friend that I worked with. That's the Institute. And we came up with 200 issues that were in anti-Mormon materials. We put them in 10 categories, and then we went after those categories and provided answers. So I was into it, and I was a defender for many years. I mean, I spent 30 years trying to make Mormonism good and right.
And did you convince yourself at this point? Like, I mean, I think there's some apologetics that I think is very disingenuous, and
Yes.
I mean, and I
Yes.
participated in it as well. And that, like, I wasn't looking for the truth. I knew what the truth was, or I knew what I wanted it to be, and then I just tried to find any possible way that could be true, and, like, that was good enough for me.
Yeah, fortunately, in 1983, most of the anti-Mormon literature was fairly poorly done,
Yeah.
and it was relatively easy to debunk. And when when we got through our 200 issues, there were only 3 that we didn't have good answers to. And um, our thinking was, well, gee, we got 197 figured out. Only 3 we don't have a good answer to. That, a little bit of faith in this works. Of course, the truth is, one foundational issue can topple the whole thing, but we just did the numbers game. So, yeah, I was seriously in, and I was seriously in through most of my career as a chaplain. What changed for me was about 1999. I injured myself in a rather serious way: neck, back, shoulder. The injuries to my spine and neck really weren't detected, and the shoulder was so painful, I just ended up in physical therapy for a year. It was a year later that the consequences of the spinal and neck injury began to unfold. And because so much time had passed, I wasn't diagnosed properly. So I spent 2 years in a cascade of misery, weird pain patterns that mimicked a heart attack, dizziness, and just chronic pain. And chronic pain, month after month after month, wears out your nervous system. And then, you're experiencing anxiety because more pain is going to come and you can't stop it. You feel powerless. And then after anxiety burns you out, you sink into depression. So you just get kicked in between the misery of anxiety and the misery of depression. And I did what most Mormons do at that time. I needed blessing. And of course, for a Mormon to get blessing from God, you got to do more good stuff. And we have a great checklist for that. So I did what most Latter-day Saints would do. You pray more, you study more, you attend more meetings, you pay more money, you go to the temple more, you serve more. And so I'm doing more. And then I started getting blessings from a variety of people. My bishop blessed me, my stake president blessed me, 2 general authorities blessed me, and I just kept getting worse and worse and worse. So everything I knew collapsed. Everything I knew did not work anymore. And I pretty much was on the brink of emotional and mental collapse when I came across a book by John Kabat-Zinn called Full Catastrophe Living, and it was a meditative program for dealing with chronic pain and stress. So that book introduced me to mindfulness, meditation, hatha yoga practice. And I could sense if I don't make this work, I'm done. So I dove into that program and I did those practices 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. And after several weeks, I finally began to find in my meditation practice a little space of peace, no fear, no anxiety, no pain. And, just to experience that for 1 minute gives you hope. And then 1 minute becomes 2 minutes, and then it's 5 minutes, and then it's 10 minutes. And then if I did my morning meditation for 20 minutes, I'm free from pain and anxiety for 20 minutes. And then after a couple of weeks of that, the question was, well, why can't I be free from this a minute after my meditation? Because it was only during the practice. And then with that intent, pretty soon it was a minute after the meditation, and then 5 minutes after the meditation. And then that began to expand. Long story short, my doctor finally decided to MRI my whole spinal column, found I had a disc shoved into my spinal column, into the, I had a spinal disc shoved into the nerve there. Yeah, spinal cord, there you go. And I had actually fractured a vertebrae in my neck, and there was some arthritic growth that was impinging on a nerve in my neck. So these mysterious symptoms that the doctors were were logging up to just stress at a physical basis. So I never got treated for those directly. I didn't want to do surgery. And actually on my own, I started practicing with a yoga bolster with my spine, and I actually got my spine in just the right position for that disc to slip back in. And that eliminated about 80% of my pain patterns and so forth. The major thing that happened, I mean, that, experiencing relief from all of that was fabulous, but I started to, a spiritual world began to open for me that I had never experienced before. A domain of spiritual perception that I had never experienced before. And that's when I realized that meditation wasn't just about stress reduction and pain management, but that it was a very deep spiritual practice. So I just dove in and started studying the different traditions of meditation, why its practices were developed. It's clearly a spiritual practice that has physical, emotional, mental, secondary benefits.
Before,
and then
up to this point, like, had you had many like spiritual experiences in Mormonism? One thing I realized that, like, going through Mormonism, due to my childhood and uh, I just retreated to a left brain, very logical, analytical, very 3D reality. And so I very little to like no spiritual experiences in Mormonism. Whereas now on this other side, I've realized, like, yeah, I mean, there were the people that were up there every fast Sunday, giving these like experiences of hearing a voice to call Aunt so-and-so, and then knowing that like she needed help right then. Like, I kind of dismissed them, but now I'm like, oh, some people just, they have that and they can get that through Mormonism, and they can get it through, not through religion. But where did you have many experiences where you're like, yeah, that was, hearing voices, or like just bizarre synchronicities that you're like undeniable, or what level of that did you experience in
Yeah,
Mormonism?
I actually had a lot of spiritual experiences in Mormonism. I see them differently now. I interpret them differently now than when I was having them. But I had really some amazing spiritual experiences. Some were interpretations of the mind. Some were, feelings of elevated emotion because something confirms my faith, or something confirms the truthfulness of Mormonism. I mean, it feels fabulous. And I did have quite a number of synchronistic experiences with other people that, in hindsight, I believe it was the spirit moving and guiding and directing. But it, now I wouldn't see that as exclusive to Latter-day Saints. It's what spirit does if you can tune in with it.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons that Mormonism was so significant to me, because to that point in my life, my deepest and most spiritual experiences had happened in a church context, and that kept me pretty well tethered. What began to happen in meditation was a different kind of spiritual experience, and that ultimately led me to what I would call a deepening or an expansion of consciousness, whereby I could, to some degree, perceive God accurately, not as a belief, not as a teaching, not as a doctrine, not as an explanation, but the actual nature, character, presence of God. And the second that happened, I suddenly realized the flaws of Mormon teaching and Mormon doctrine, because the teaching of the nature and character of God in Mormonism, God is really kind of a transactional, almost dysfunctional parent at times. And I suddenly realized this is nonsense. And so I had several realizations that caused me to see the problems in Mormon doctrine and teaching, culture and practice, just that discernment of the true nature of God. Once there's some accurate discernment and direct experience of the true nature of God, most things judged through that lens bring about wisdom and genuine knowledge, and things that are contrary to that are obviously not helpful or healthy. So,
which is interesting, because I mean, this is what Joseph Smith harped on too, is that the most fundamental thing is to really know the true nature of God, and at sometimes you see him tapping into it, and King Follett's discourse, or even the lectures on faith, it's, I think in there it's talking about the Holy Spirit is the mind that God and Jesus share. And so at some points you see he is tapping into it, but then he kind of jerks back to me, he seems like a very, very literalistic, and where the creeds had this more one side of the paradox of God is this ineffable everywhere and nowhere and big and small and whatnot. That is true. It's this one side, and the other side wasn't really reflected, where he's no, God has a body. He is an individual. He is like us. We can become like God. And so it does seem to me that he had these different parts. The one is just this knee-jerk reaction away from this ineffable, amorphous other thing. And so he creates this God that is the father that he wished he had, but also modeled after the traits of his father. I think that, you look at Joseph Smith Sr. and, I look often back at the trauma that Joseph Smith went through with his surgeries, and how much that must have traumatized his psyche, where on the one side he's probably saying how could my father have done that to me, held me down when these men did these things to me. But then you're justifying to yourself, well, no, he did it because he loved me, and this is what he tells me. And so I think you do get this messed up version of well, God is somebody that is very cruel because ultimately it's for our good. So it is interesting that in some ways Joseph Smith, I think, there was a part of him that was tapping into it, and I think continually redefining what this idea of God was. But then also he was held back by his own limitations, and also the church's limitation. I think you see that in King Follett's discourses, where it's I could use all these texts, but if I use anything other than the Bible, you're going to call it heretical. So it's interesting that. I think that is true. It's the true nature of what quote unquote God is the key to understanding everything.
Yeah, I thought maybe at some point we would. It's a popular. It's a in certain groups. It's a popular discussion now as to whether or not Joseph Smith was really a mystic and had mystical experiences. Although there are some statements, and there are some statements in the Doctrine and Covenants and statements in some of his own sermons that seem to reflect a mystical consciousness, but 99% of how he acted and what he did to me does not reflect a mystical consciousness. So I see that as more substantively who he really was, although he clearly had a genuine interest in those things. But when the rubber meets the road, and we might talk about this later, I just don't see him as a genuine mystic. Nobody who's experienced the true nature and character of God would do what he did.
I think it's interesting because I do see that there are people on either side of the spectrum that are pretty easy to classify. That's Buddha or these people, they're pretty cut and dry. You don't find shadows in the closet. And then there's other people that no, this was definitely a narcissistic fraud that was hell bent on manipulating people. But I do, and those are I think we kind of gravitate towards those because they're simpler and easier for us to classify. But then you do find, at least I've found, a lot of people in the middle, because I think there is this interesting overlap and interplay between psychopathology and schizophrenia and unhealthy, unintegrated, kind of bipolar, manic depressive, and that. And there's similarities to like Kundalini awakenings and spiritual awakenings, and some pretty good research on like, okay, this is the differences, but it isn't so cut and dry. And so I do see these people that, and being a believer in like IFS and parts work and whatnot, and feeling my own individual parts, that to me is the easiest and what makes the most sense to me. I think there are certain aspects of, if you look at the research on like what mystical experiences are defined in the psychedelic research, and these scales that they have, the mystical experience questionnaire and whatnot. On the one hand, I think he checks so many of those boxes of like ineffability and transcendence of time and space, and that I think it's kind of comical to say like, oh, he made all of this up, because it's hard to know all those boxes to check if you don't have any, unless you're really, really copying word for word, which, some people claim that. But to me, I think that because of how much trauma he went through, and because of the very real possibility of entheogens and substances, especially their place in folk magic, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. And yes, that's kind of what I've kind of pieced together of what makes the most sense to me. But I think it is definitely much less of a cleaner, any mystical traits is much less clean and pure than what you easily find elsewhere.
Yeah. And we probably need to and will talk about what I would call this middle ground. I haven't mentioned Deepak Chopra yet. I started attending the Chopra Center and attending his seminars, and then I enrolled in his teacher training program. He used to love, I can't remember who the author of the quote was, but he used to love to quote the phrase, this is a motley group of saints, psychotics, and sages, which kind of, brings all those folks together that you're talking about. And then, how do you sort out who's a saint and who's a psychotic? And
I think William James has a quote or something that like the mystic swims with the light in the same waters that the psychotic drowns, or something.
Yeah. But anyway, I began to have these kind of synchronistic meetings with Chopra. We would meet. I mean, we would be out for a walk in the evening at the same time in the same place. And so we started interacting, and he was so helpful in helping me refine my meditation practice. And then I was going to be a Chopra Center meditation teacher, and then he left substantially, and I didn't like the group that took over. So I didn't do that. I did other meditation teacher training, and then there were so many people in Utah interested in learning meditation. I just started getting one call after another, and I would do one seminar, and somebody from that seminar would host another, and they would host another. And for about 10 years, I traveled all over Utah, California, Washington State, Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Texas, doing meditation seminars. I mean, super busy, and primarily with groups of Latter-day Saints, the kind of on the edge groups, the study groups or the meeting groups that are trying to either deal with issues or deepen their understanding and so forth. Wonderful people. And during that period, I wrote the 4 articles that I have that were done for Sunstone magazine. And then at the beginning of that period also, I met a gentleman named Roy Eugene Davis, who was the last living direct guru disciple of Yogananda, the author of Autobiography of a Yogi. So Yogananda was a Indian guru who came to America in 1920 and pioneered home study, and he had a massive impact and all across the country. Ended up headquartering in Los Angeles, and Roy became a disciple of his at age 18 in 1948, and he ended up leaving that group and starting his own ministry. But anyway, I met him. We talked for a year. I went on a retreat to his retreat center. And then he took me on as a personal disciple for 13 years until he passed away in 2019. So between Chopra and Roy, I had really good instruction in the mechanics of meditation practice and in the interpretation of mystical experience. It's in the interpretation of whatever you want to call it, mystical experience or phenomena, that a lot of the trouble begins. And so I do, for right or wrong, tend to see things pretty clearly because of that training with some rather advanced, mature people. So that's pretty much it. I taught meditation, wrote articles, did presentations for a number of years. I started tailing off about 2017. Started doing less and less, cared for my mother in her last couple of years. And people forget about you pretty quick.
Can you,
So
how did like, was there a faith crisis? How did like the tension of like, hey, I'm getting all this stuff that I either used to get and even more from Mormonism. And then, can you speak to, I think I heard in another episode, you did a fair amount of counseling with couples. And I think you said like, you were realizing that like the principles of Mormonism just weren't working for marriages.
Yeah, they weren't working in people's hearts. They weren't working at the core of people's lives and relationships. For me, I had, again, because of my enmeshment of personal identity with the church, I had to make it work. I had to make it right, or I would be destroyed. And when I had this, what I would call God realization, it was over. There was no more conflict. There was no more struggle. There was no more need to make anything right. God was right. God was present. And suddenly Mormonism, which had been so huge in my life, was now this. It was just a little bitty thing that didn't have much impact anymore. Impact of Mormonism was huge at first because it took an immature teenager and turned him into a more responsible person who wanted to do the right thing all the time. But then, Mormonism has a center of gravity, and that center of gravity is essentially belief in right living as it defines it. And once you get past that, there's no deep inner spiritual life. That's why I was doing so many seminars for Mormons, because they wanted to experience deep, rich inner living or spirituality. And so we still attend church. I'm still active in church. There are many things I won't do. I won't do things that engage me in the promotion of Mormonism as it is, but I'll teach, and that's about it. So, and I try to extend the discussion within the context and without creating problems, but yet lifting and expanding the vision of what's in the scriptures and so forth. But no, that 30 years of fighting, struggling, making it right, and then in an instant, boom, no more need to do that.
Yeah, I think that enmeshment, it's not only with the church, but I see and experience it in relationships too, is that you are very enmeshed with your partner, and like they need to be doing the right things. They need to be keeping all the commandments, because otherwise like your salvation is on the line. And it's it destroys marriages. And it's sad because I believe that the church and the leaders of the church genuinely want to improve marriages and want to improve mental health. But I see kind of like a toddler, there is this inner struggle of, like I want to do these things, but nobody's going to tell me to do it. And I'm not going to apologize if I ever do anything wrong. And so it is interesting. Like, why do you think that? I mean, they're so like, once you explore therapy, once you explore meditation and Eastern philosophy, and there are so many things that could benefit and add to a Mormon spirituality even before it becomes challenging. Why do you think that it's just not on the radar? Like, I mean, I never heard about meditation in Mormonism. I guess David O. McKay was into it, but yeah, you just don't hear about it. There's so many mental health and like nervous system regulation stuff that like I would be much better to talk about that at general conference than like telling people about how they need to like walk out of movie theaters because something's going on the screen. What are your thoughts on why that doesn't get airtime? Is it lack of knowledge?
Yeah,
Or
my suspicion is that it's subconscious, but I think the leaders can sense that what I would call inner path, inner practice spirituality empowers individuals. It gives them clarity. It strengthens their conscience and sense of self. It strengthens their spiritual independence. And when that occurs, you have less power over members, and potentially they might be less loyal to the organization. And there's no question that leadership is primarily about the strengthening and unifying of the organization at the expense of the individual, if need be. I've seen too many good people cut off because they were considered a threat. And so I've known many of the brethren, worked with many of the brethren. I've loved many of them and appreciated many of them. I've disliked several. And the ones I liked were ones that kind of had a deeper vision and wanted to do things that I would say were more Christ-like. But even they, in their positions, got resistance and weren't really able to integrate, into church teaching and practice those kind of deeper Christ-like developments in spirituality. So, yeah, I don't think. My wife and I just finished teaching the 10-week emotional resilience course in our ward, and there's one little section in there on mindfulness practice. And when I first saw the topic, I got all excited and I thought, oh, this is great, man. I'm really going to be able to ground this particular group, in mindfulness perspective and practice. And then I actually read the material that's there, and they share kind of a simple mindfulness breathing exercise. But at the top, it says, only teach this, nothing else. Don't go beyond this.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's interesting because you hear like Christians talk about how like yoga is evil and like you're summoning the devil and stuff, which sounds humorous, but like even Mormonism has some sort of
but I through my meditation teaching and through people who just maybe will read an article and call me Latter-day Saints, there are so many that want this, that sense the value of it. And they'll study with me for a little while and they'll get all excited, but it's not resonant with what's going on in church. And so it puts them in conflict. And some will practice secretly. Some will just give it up because it causes too much discord, either in a marriage or their church relationship. But there are many, many Latter-day Saints that do have a desire for deeper, richer spirituality. They just don't know where to find it, and they keep doing the same stuff over and over, hoping it will emerge, and it doesn't.
This is on speculation, but I'm curious to, I guess first, one thing that bothered me in the church is when you would hear the apostles talk about, like, in somewhat veiled terms, these powerful witness experiences that they have. And some of it I think maybe because they've had some experiences that are ineffable or difficult for them to explain. But I think there's also some of it that's like, well, if it doesn't hurt if the audience comes away with an idea that there's more of an experience than I really had. So that is a question of mine, is like, I wonder how much I don't buy that the apostles and the prophet are these narcissistic. Yeah, again, I believe that people have many parts. I think that there are some significant parts of these people that doubt themselves uh, and have this inner struggle, and then they kind of have to double down because like that's too painful. Like they have so too much on the line to even consider that for a second. Um, but then I also wonder, like, you know, again, there are people that are very prone to these types of experiences. The one of my episodes, I compare my Kundalini awakening, which was a pretty bizarre spiritual urgency, fall under that classification, to this study that talked about, examining people that went through spontaneous spiritual awakenings or Kundalini awakenings. And, there are certain traits, both like physiologically, I think it was temporal lobe lability of people that have this ability to get into these different states. So I don't know, some of the brethren may be very prone to these experience or mystical light experiences. But as you said, it's the interpretation. It's one thing to have them, but the other half of the battle is to interpret it. So, so first question is like, so it's helpful for me, and I've tried to like explain like what exactly happened in my mystical experiences, so that it's not just this amorphous, like, yeah, you feel like you merge with God or whatnot. So can you take a moment to just kind of, like, in the 3D world, what are these experiences like for you? And are they only when you're meditating,
Oh, yeah,
or how does it appear day to
yeah,
day?
very good question. So I talk a lot about awakening, to what does somebody awaken? Um, to me, it was what is encapsulated in what's been called the perennial philosophy. So I think it was maybe Spinoza that coined that phrase, but others have worked with it. But, philosophers and sages have discerned and realized that there's been a core spiritual teaching from the beginnings. And that typically has been described as 3 points. The first point being, beneath the world of form and change, as we experience it, there is an infinite, formless, changeless reality. So if you want to call it spirit or God. The second point is that this same reality constitutes the essence of our being. So beneath this world of form and change, matter and movement, there is this formless reality, which is actually more substantive than the formed reality because it's eternal and infinite, right? So it's more substantive. And the formed reality actually emerged from that. So it literally is foundational. But for that reality to be the essence of my being, wow, that, I experienced myself so many years as the foibled, flawed, immature, absurd human being, to suddenly have an experience that, wow, deep within me, there is this likeness and image of God. Literally, not metaphorically, literally. That is my divine nature. So that's the second point of the perennial philosophy. And then the third is that the purpose of this life is to discover and awaken to that reality. You could say realize God, however, whatever language you want to use. And that realization really requires that there be some level of direct experience and direct knowing. It's got to be beyond the mind, right? If it's just thoughts, then it's not infinite and eternal or changeless. So it has to be a perception of a reality that's beyond what the mind can comprehend. And if I can comprehend that, I'm only going to be able to comprehend it by that aspect of divine nature that's within me. So in a genuine awakening, and it happens differently for people, two things ought to be happening. Number one, some degree, some level of direct knowledge and experience of this deeper reality, the divine reality, God, Spirit, and also some sort of direct experience that somehow I'm one with that, right? So according to the Perennial philosophy, that's the purpose of our lives, to have that realization. The word realization meaning both direct experience and knowledge, which in theory should also be the definition of mystical experience, but mysticism gets applied way beyond that. I think a fourth thing needs to be added. I don't know who I am to add to the perennial philosophy, but I guess I'm going to do it anyway. For me, the fourth thing that needs to be added is that once that awakening occurs and that experience occurs, we are then guided to integrate that formless reality into the world of form.
Mm-hmm.
As we experience it today, as we will experience it in the future. Without that integration, I don't think the full purpose is understood. So, you know, I mean, I'm deeply in the yoga tradition. I mean, at this point, I'm kind of a Christian yogi, and I'll get Jesus in there somehow. But you have this realization of oneness, and it is so expansive and glorious and blissful. It's like this is the ultimate reality, and to a degree it is. This is the ultimate reality, so every other reality needs to be put aside. And so the bulk of Buddhism, the bulk of Advaita Vedanta, they completely disparage at this point the formed reality or the material reality, at best a stepping stone, but certainly insignificant and to be left behind. And then they're going to all transcend into oneness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. I had that realization. I mean, first there was a realization of the true nature, character, presence of God, the mystery, that formless reality, which I would describe as consciousness, existence, being, or spirit. I like to use the word spirit for that. Oddly, Mormonism uses the word spirit to define a refined material reality.
Yeah, it's backwards.
And so we get stuck in a dualism or a materialism, when in fact, spirit refers to this formless reality of consciousness and existence. And then there's the awakening to the fact that God is in and through and above all things. So it's God as immanent, present in and through all things, which is reflected even in LDS scriptures, right? As light of Christ, Holy Spirit, in and through all things, giving life to all things. So God is clearly immanent, but he's also transcendent. He's not limited by the domain of form and movement. And so God is both, and this is affirmed in the great yoga scriptures, God is both transcendent and immanent in a non-dual way, which is a discussion in and of itself. So it's not two things smashed together. It's this paradoxical union of opposites, so to speak. And when I first had this experience of transcendence, it was still personal. Ken Wilber has a great model of what he called the 1, 2, 3 of God. So he was pointing out how you can experience God in first person, second person, third person. Third person experience would be like God, you're experiencing God in nature. It's in something outside of yourself, but it's a deep presence that resonates within yourself. Second person, which would be relationship, God as relating to me. as an individual. And then there's first person experience where there is this pure oneness where subject and object disappears, and you're having an experience of oneness with and in God. So my initial transcendental experiences were still personal. It was me experiencing this transcendence, right? Both were still present. And then after some years, just
And
spontaneous.
what did it feel like? Like if something, because I think that's one of the hard things is like you don't know what you don't know. So the like for me, it's like I was feeling things I couldn't even comprehend were possible to feel. It's like anything I felt kind of the spirit, but like orders of magnitude more.
Boy, of course, this is everywhere in spiritual literature that words can't. If you can
Mm-hmm.
put it in words, that's not it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the Tao. But boy, there was an expansiveness, there was a connectedness, there was a joyfulness, there was a hopefulness. There was a sense of flow with divine will and purpose. This sense of the largeness of things, the interconnectedness of things. Everything was alive. I mean, we were living in Hawaii at the time I started all this, and I'd go out into my backyard, which just had birds and trees, and it was just beautiful. And, I just began feeling these interactions with nature and the aliveness. And that occurred from transcendence. That's the weird thing is the experience of transcendence ultimately results in a perception of divine immanence. See, without the transcendence, you don't perceive the divinity in and through and with all things.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of had both of those going at the same time, but they were they were all very personal, right? It's me experiencing this with other things, creatures, creations, people, and so forth. I had an amazing experience of the immanence of spirit, life, intelligence, energy in my own body. That was quite remarkable. I at that point thought the experience of this transcendence was the pinnacle, and then I had this experience of immanence in my own being, and that was physically overwhelming. I mean, when it first occurred, I had to stop it because I did feel like I was going to dissolve. And then the more I got used to it, I suddenly realized that I could reach the same state of God union by either a transcendental meditative practice where I left body and mind behind, or an immanence practice where I went deeply into the mind and body. I always ended up in the same,
Mm-hmm.
I would end up in the same place. And then I can't remember the year, but in this one year, I had two spontaneous, extraordinary experiences. I used to always be fearful, in the yoga literature, there's always this metaphor of the ocean and the waves. God is the ocean, we are the waves. Well, okay, it makes sense, but wait a minute. If I'm a wave, the wave always collapses back into the ocean, and then where do I go?
Mm-hmm.
You see? And that image was used so much, and I knew there was truth in it, but it was so fearful. I didn't want to experience that, right? I just want to stay the wave,
Mm-hmm.
moving all the time and not being reabsorbed. So I'm loving the ocean, appreciating the ocean, allowing the ocean to propel me, but I want the wave to keep going. So this one year I had these two experiences where I experienced the absorption of my personal being, my individual being into the ocean. And when it first happened, I was laughing so hard because I had had all this fear, right? What happens when my wave goes away?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm experiencing myself as the ocean. And I'm thinking, this is like a child with an ice cream cone that falls and he loses it. He's crying and crying and crying, and the parents going, 10-cent cone, no big deal. And so I lived in that consciousness for about a year after those two experiences, where transcendence was the substantive and the individual person and personality was almost inconsequential. And I felt fabulous. I felt expanded. I felt joyful. I felt connected. And
what would like day to day, like what does that feel like when you're out grocery shopping?
So let me, lest I be deceptive here. I wouldn't say that this was experienced in an absolute fullness, right? It was substantive. It was, I could lose it for a little bit of time, a crisis, a pain, something odd that is just going to capture your, it's threatening to your family or your individuality, your life, your home, or whatever it is. And you have to form the Phil guy identity to take care of business. But I could very easily take care of that and return to that I'm calling it transcendence, but to that first person experience of God, first person experience, pure oneness. And I thought that was it, right? This is it. This will expand, this will deepen, this will become more natural. I'll get drawn out of it less. I mean, that was my expectation. And I really do think that what I call the monists, who end up denying individuality, I think they're just stuck there. It's a great place to be stuck. I don't blame them one bit, but it doesn't come full circle. And so one day I was meditating and I was very profoundly in this state, first person experience of God. And then all of a sudden the little Phil me emerged. And it was like, well, where did you come from? And why are you here? But it emerged in such a way that, listen, brother, I'm here. I'm not going away. I'm part of this process, right? And I suddenly began to have an experience of individuality that did not conflict with the transcendence. Does that make sense? So this is true non-duality, right? It's the universal and the personal coming into one, paradoxically, meaning they're both present without violating the nature of each other, but their full reality of both is present. And so when I had that first experience of oneness, I still have my Christian mindset. So when I had that first experience of oneness, the thought that came into my mind was, whoa, this is atonement, right? This is atonement. Not some poor, nice, pure guy being tortured and killed and shedding blood all over the place. So some God who requires this torture can be appeased so he can forgive sin, right? That's not atonement. That's pagan craziness as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going, wow, this is atonement, you see? And that's when I realized several things, that all of these things that I had realized in my personal experience and the perennial philosophy, this is what Jesus was teaching. This is what Jesus was revealing. This is what Jesus was and is mediating. He's bringing us into that, do you see, to share with him. So I had this realization of atonement. I had this realization, oh man, this is what Jesus is really about. So now I'm able to come full circle, not, through yoga, but back into Christianity. It's really mystical Christianity. So what am I? Well, a Christian yogi or a yogic Christian, who knows? I mean, but when I had this experience I'm describing now of the individual reemerging, not to be discarded, like
Mhm.
the wave going into the ocean, but now an integral part of the creation, manifestation, and expression of God. God manifesting himself uniquely in the domain of form with an ongoing purpose, right? With an ongoing purpose. And then I went, that's what resurrection is. You see,
Mhm.
suddenly atonement and resurrection make sense to me. And the fact that it was ended up becoming centered in Jesus, it was like, wow.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like it's funny because you do feel, at least I felt like, okay, I'm going to walk away from all of this. I mean, I had left Mormonism and I was like, I don't really think that there's a truth that you can figure out. If you could, we would have figured it out by now, not realizing that like the wisdom traditions had already figured out. I just didn't know
Oh, yeah.
what I was looking for. And I just kind of floated around there. I did start having some of these insights of like, well, I guess when I die, I am atoms, and the atoms will go back into the earth and it will become other things. So I guess I don't cease to exist because I define myself as like atoms. Or I also thought like maybe I'm like a leaf on a tree and I will fall off the tree, but like I'll go back into the ground, like, and like that I'm part of a bigger organism that will continue to exist. Or another one was like, well, if I will continue to exist in the minds of my children and like the impact that I've had on them. So I started like intuitively kind of like mini downloading these concepts. But it wasn't until I like just walked in the other direction where I'm like, okay, my life is collapsing, I'm getting divorced, um, move cross country, whatever I've been doing hasn't been working. So I'm going to get into like figure out therapy and psychology. And I'm going to like, I guess I'm going to be an atheist. I'm going to like start meditating with Sam Harris. And I remember like being in those early meditations of like, okay, I don't believe in God. Like I'm deciding like, and then it's like, oh, like, yeah, I mean, of course I believe in God. It's just everything. Like the only thing that's all present, all knowing, all seeing, like the only thing that meets that definition is the totality of all of existence. And it's
Right.
not something separate. Like I am part of that. And so it was this, I had to walk in the opposite direction to then finally find and get everything I was seeking for where I was. But it is funny that like then like looping back, I'm like, oh, like Christ is like, to me, I was like, Christ is much more Buddhist than he is Christian. And as I like reading the Bible and like seeing all these mindful things and like the atonement, like at one mint, like it's all there. And like, what is, I mean, Mormonism kind of captures this well, is like they have this idea of like, oh, what really happened was the Garden of Gethsemane when he like felt all suffering over all time of all, not only humans and animals. It's like, but yeah, that happens when you have a mystical experience where you transcend time and space and species and everything. Like you feel everything. So it's not just all the suffering you feel, it's all the joy and bliss and everything. But we just focus on that. So like it all makes sense. It's all there. But that's what's difficult about this is if you've never experienced it, you can only describe it in the terms that you've had. And so that's, yeah, I guess in your experience of like from somebody who's never experienced this or like maybe never had like spiritual experiences in Mormonism, um, like in a 3D sense, like what does it feel like to be in this unitive state? Like visually, are things the same? Are your interactions with people the same? Um, is time the same? Space, emotions? And it's not,
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like
It's
it's
not,
just when you're
no.
meditating, because I think
Oh,
that's
okay.
one of,
I didn't follow up on that. Um, for me, and I can only talk about me, for me, these experiences were by and large confined to my inner practice, my meditation and so forth. But the objective of this, and not, Deepak Chopra taught me this quite, the idea is for this to expand where that state of consciousness is present all the time. Well, all the time is quite a lofty goal, right? Because you still got a body that has needs and desires,
Mm-hmm.
and there's people around you, and there's life going on, and so forth. But with time and with experience, it's just more. It's easier to hold on to that, and it's easier to recall it when you realize it's slipped for a minute. It is rare that I don't. I mean, sometimes you get involved in things that are purely of an egoic nature, but it is very rare for me not to have some level of awareness of God, of divine presence, goodness. Very rare for that to slip away. And that's, and I assume that will deepen and be more and more realized, where there's not much difference between the meditative state and the life state. And every, Yogananda in my yoga lineage, and Roy Eugene Davis and Chopra, they all taught that, that the day is going to come when all this is going to merge into one.
Mm-hmm.
And your form life, your external life, is going to reflect that divine reality.
Yeah, I think what's interesting.
The integration is the challenge.
Yeah.
The awakening is a little easier than the integration.
And I think what's interesting and what I enjoy about coming together with somebody like you is that we've had very different paths. And I think that's because it's easy, I think, to have one path and just this is the way, this is what happens for everybody. Where, and yours seem to be, a little more progressive, whereas mine was none of these experiences in my life, big crisis in my life, and then very much, I don't know if you're familiar with Stan Grof's work, the Czech psychiatrist that did a lot with LSD and then created holotropic breath work after. So he talks about, he coined, I think with his partner, the term spiritual emergency. So that's this spontaneous spiritual awakening, or particularly Kundalini awakening. And I don't think they're very well-defined terms, but it's just I kind of describe it as you're on the highway, you're in the left lane, and some people realize, okay, a mile from now, I need to take that exit that's four lanes over. And so they'll slowly move over lane by lane by lane. I'm just going, cruising along. I'm distracted, got ADHD. At the very last minute, I'm oh, there's my exit. I'm going, too fast. And so it's jerking the wheel to the other side. And both people have moved the same amount of distance laterally, but it's kind of how chaotic and how it manifests. So it's interesting for me because my experiences, were largely endogenous. And so I didn't know about any of these things. I didn't know really about wisdom traditions, or I'd started listening to Alan Watts, and so I was getting introduced to some of these things. And my experiences weren't in meditation, and largely haven't been in meditation. So it was bizarre at one point, I was just in bed and just started having these involuntary kriyas, contractions throughout my body. It felt good. I had no clue what was going on. And so I remember a few nights later, I was can I reproduce that? I don't know how many minutes they lasted. And that's a pretty classic thing with Kundalini awakenings. But then, I remember just starting to have these bliss states. And one thing you mentioned in this is about when I had listened to the episode with you and Bill Reel. And one thing that was really helpful, and it's something that we don't really talk about too much because it is kind of this taboo morality, but you talked about this isn't an orgasmic experience. And to me, it's that's what it was. It was the same feeling that you like are seeking after an experience in sexual intimacy, but it's not about sexuality, and it's not confined to like one part of your body. Like this is just your whole being, and you're like talking to another person that you don't have any romantic interest in, but you're just like, oh my gosh, like this is another part of me, or this nature, like I am a part of this. And you like feel this kind of buzzing or energy or just pure joy. And it's weird that it's like, oh, this is the same thing. And I started to conceptualize like, oh, like sex is, it's kind of the best imitation that we can get at without doing any work um, in like the 3D world, but it's actually not the final destination. There is this like union, and we can experience it a bit with like physical intimacy with another person, because that's kind of part of what creates this evolution of consciousness and in healing, is like coming together with another person, like two souls becoming one, two bodies becoming one, and creating new life. But it's like that's kind of like a side road, a stop, maybe the last stop before the real destination, which people talk about like nirvana or bliss or whatnot. And that you can actually start to experience that in a variety of situations, out in nature, meditating, connecting with a friend. And so you start having this, you become less confined to feeling this contentment and peace in substances or in addictions or in scrolling or in sex. And it starts to, expand throughout your life. And maybe it's not just in meditation. It's like you start to feel this throughout. And so that was bizarre for me because I didn't know what to expect. And then I'd also have these experiences of a couple of experiences where, again, not in meditation, but it was like at work with a coworker, just being introduced to these like Hindu ideas of like, we're all one in this divine dream. And like, this is another person that is part of you. Like you're actually the dreaming mind rather than the dream avatar. And in these moments, like just talking to somebody visually, like everything became so much more beautiful and rich in color and resolution. And like, it was filled with this love. Like the other person became much more beautiful, but not in like a romantic sense or like a worldly beautiful sense. It was like a high definition photograph. And so very bizarre experiences to be like, have no way to, did not know what to expect. And there was no substance that I was like, okay, I took this an hour ago and it's just messing with the chemicals in my head. So that's kind of my path, and it sounds different, the similarities but different than yours, and I think that's helpful to see like, you can kind of do more of this yogic path and people get into it this way, and other people are kind of thrust into it through these kind of bizarre and chaotic and sometimes very ungrounded experiences. And even those can go, you can integrate those, or some of those end up turning out really poorly and being going a different direction. So thoughts on that?
Go ahead. Yeah, I've met very few. There are a few. I admire them, but I've met very few people who are deep into what I call the inner path that didn't start on that path as a result of some sort of trauma, suffering, life upheaval. That was certainly my case, and most people that I've worked with and interacted with, something has motivated them enough to push them out of their typical patterns and beliefs and structures, right? It usually takes a crisis to do that. There are those 2 or 3 glorious people who move toward the inner path just because they love and they love God and they want God and they love people. And it's, I worship those people. I had to be forced into it through crises. The discussion I had with Bill Reel was I initiated that because I was unhappy with him somewhat justifying pornography and polyamory and what I consider to be other violations of morality. And I was trying to take a stand for tried and prude. There's a Freudian slip. Oh, you caught me. Tried in true spiritual principles through the ages, even in the wisdom traditions. In both yoga and Buddhism, um, I'm more familiar with yoga, but in Buddhism, right speech, right action, right. If you live in an immoral, immature, and of course, morality is there's debate there about what is and what isn't. But if you live immorally, irresponsibly, or immaturely, you're going to have a very difficult time transcending mind and ego to experience pure spiritual perception, right? Because those things tie you to the ego, entrench your identity more in the ego. And I think many of the moral, ethical standards in both yoga and Buddhism were to help subdue the unhealthy tendencies of the ego, so a person through inner work practices could begin to transcend the mind and move into spiritual expansion of consciousness or spiritual perception. And that's been my experience with most people. I've seen a whole lot of folks, experimenting with things that were forbidden to them before. I've rarely seen good fruit come out of that. And I spent so many years in counseling with people that, and I've worked with people kind of in dark tantric traditions, where they try to use sexuality for spiritual awakening and so forth. I've just rarely ever seen that work, and I've seen disaster. When people use substances or addicted to substances, psychedelics are kind of an interesting sidebar to that, or sexuality, or infatuations with other people and so forth. I just rarely seen that go well. So I tend to do the traditional teaching of it's like the Yoga Sutras or the Eightfold Path. Let's get some mature moral action going on to subdue the ego a little bit. You're not going to totally do it. Only transcendence is ultimately going to result in the crucifixion or death of the ego and the emergence of the divine nature. And then we'll work on inner path stuff. So I'm pretty traditional in that way. There are people that transcend that. Alan Watts, I love, well, I love hate. Not hate's not the right word. I love and disappointed in Alan Watts. He was so brilliant. I've read his stuff in and out multiple times, and listened to everything that's been recorded. He has provided me so much insight, and somehow intellectually he has this spiritual comprehension, or this comprehension of spiritual truths that for me only made sense through transcendence, and how he could figure that out. Now, he did do transcendence practices, but for whatever reason, he was addicted to smoking, he was addicted to alcohol, he was addicted to women. I mean, he's violating all of my prudish standards. And yet, having these amazing insights that are teaching me and nourishing me, right?
Yeah, I think.
So I struggled with that for some years, but I had a knee replacement recently, and I was stuck on the couch for 6 weeks. And I read the letters of Alan Watts. So his two of his daughters edited and put together all of his personal correspondence. And that's what I read when I was sitting on the couch with my new knee. And in his private letters, I mean, he's doing this polyamory thing, right? And he's disrupting people's lives, and he's making these women miserable. I mean, they have bliss with him for a short period of time, and then he's on to somebody else. And then he's creating chaos in their lives and sadness in their lives. And it bothered him a lot. And there's a couple of places where to close friends, he admits, I have failed to live in harmony with what I know to be true. So
yeah, I think
anyway,
for me, I've that was actually very helpful and interesting in that discussion with him, because I feel like I align with both sides, and I think this is where the perspective and seeing where people come from, and how far they've, what direction they need to go is crucial. I mean, you can be on the opposite side of the room from somewhere, and or you've got a mountain, you're on the east side of it, I'm on the west side of it, and you can be shouting at me like, we got to, west is the way up the mountain, whereas to me, I'm like, no, no, west takes me further. And so that's what's so difficult. And I see this kind of with attachment too, is like, the path of healing for like somebody that's anxious, preoccupied, is actually the opposite path for somebody that's dismissing attachment. And so it's been interesting to, yeah, my fiance was not raised religious at all. And it's been interesting to hear her and like her friends' journey about like, these are people that had no rules about, like morality and whatnot, had all the freedom to like drink and do, whatever with whoever they wanted. And yet she's like one of the most spiritual and kind and loving people that I know. And like, she's not doing all those things because like she figured it out. You get
Oh,
it out
good.
of your system, and you
Yeah.
actually like, I think this is what I had to learn from Mormonism, is that Mormonism teaches you so much. You can't trust yourself. The natural man is an enemy to God, and like, you don't do these substances because you will lose control of yourself. And like, that is not to be trusted. And don't be alone with somebody of the opposite gender when you're married, because like, that's just a slippery slope here. And so it is this paralyzing fear of like, oh, like myself, like I am broken and unclean. And so my path to healing, like that was what I had to heal. And I think that's what a lot of people, it's this developmental milestone that Mormonism robs people of. And so it's been interesting to see that like, Mormonism teaches, do these substances, peer pressure, it's such a bad thing. Your peers are going to have you do this and that. And then, yeah, have all these friends that weren't raised religious, and like, they're not alcoholics, and they have a very healthy relationship with alcohol. Yet then I have these friends, that I knew from Mormonism, that now are leaving, and they're just recklessly, yeah, doing polyamory or substances, and they don't have any peer groups to say like, hey, you've probably drank too much, like I'm going to drive you home, or like, hey, this is, they're doing this on their own, because really, that, yeah, there is peer pressure, and that is something to be aware of. But it's learning and development, where people have learned like, hey, I don't actually like just being drunk and wasted, I don't like these one night stands. And if you can go through those things, I think, without the shame and the guilt, you get to the other side so much quicker. It's like a fool that's left to persist in their ways will become wise. Like when somebody is saying like, nope, you're doing that wrong, you can't do this, they kind of never learn. And so I think it's tough, because leaving Mormonism, you have so much to unwind. You've been going down a certain path for so long, that to get on the right path in some way requires you to go back the whole path that you've been on until you get to the right branch point. So that's been, yeah, it's been interesting to see. And for me, it was like, I was, and a lot of people are the type of person that I remember, just 2.5 years ago, I was at some Airbnb and I was cleaning up, and, I saw some self mammogram exam thing on the shower, and I like immediately looked away, and I like, I can't look twice, because that's, um, everything was this ethical, moral, like
Right.
last stand. And then I was like, no, I'm just going to look. And I was like, oh, like there's nothing, actually what I was resisting was, yeah, it's the resistance. And I think this is where Buddhism comes into it. It's, yeah, there are these things that are kind of best practices, but it's resistance or attachment that really is the key thing. And when you're resisting so much, I can't do this, or I can't do that, or I have to have this, or I have to have that. Like if you don't sort that out, it doesn't matter like what best practices. I think that's been my experience. It's definitely a balance, and everybody comes from a different position.
Yeah, I agree. And it could be my counseling experience where I've seen people get into so much trouble with these things, has um, caused me to see it more in that light. Um, for me, it just I mean, when I grew up, and I'd left church and I had no boundaries at that point. I smoked a cigarette one day with some friends. It made my body so sick. I was in bed for 48 hours, just feeling like I'd been poisoned. I thought, I'm not paying for this. Gone, you know. Alcohol. A friend of mine grabbed a bottle of whiskey. We drank it. I was in bed for 48 hours, feeling like I was poisoned, and I thought, I'm not paying for this.
Mm-hmm.
And then, um, watching what goes on. If somebody's in a committed relationship and they violate that, man, the suffering and misery, you know. The challenge is if your relationship isn't growing, isn't intimate, isn't satisfying, then there's the dilemma of, do I hang in there when there seems to be no promise of harmony and intimacy. So I've overall pretty much stuck to the kind of the basic moral standards, and but I don't doubt that there are people maybe a little more mature than what I've been dealing with that get into X, Y, or Z and they go, man, this isn't going anywhere. I'm going to give it up, right? And they've learned that through the wisdom of experience. So you just hope that people don't fall off the cliff while they're doing that. So
yeah, and I think it's interesting because, like you said earlier, and I agree, like that I don't really know anybody that I would consider like awakened or on this path that didn't get shoved onto this path, like
yeah,
they're forced their hand because
yeah,
everything else, in intense suffering, whether it's
yeah,
physical or,
yeah,
or mental or
yeah,
spiritual. And so I think that's kind of the missing key, is that, yeah, some of these people that think, oh, I'm going to open up my marriage because this is the solution, and it brings intense, pain and suffering and,
yeah.
chaos, that actually sometimes that is what causes that it's people's addictions or people's. So how do we kind of honor people's own ability to explore while kind of witnessing that and helping, but not handicapping and saying like, no, this is the right way for you. That's a tough balance, I think, to follow as a parent. As I did as a missionary, I trained and I learned that I was so exactly obedient, and I would make sure we got up at time. And the minute I wasn't their companion anymore, it was like a limb that had had a cast on for 6 months, and then like it's off. And there's no innate growth, and it's like, well, I was just told what to do. So
No,
that is a tough balance.
yeah, yeah,
What are your thoughts on yeah, so in this weekend, I'm up here in Portland, and so a couple of the guys that put together the Entheomagus, the kind of short form documentary on Joseph Smith and the theory of entheogens, psychedelics being involved in early Mormonism, um, particularly like the group spiritual experiences. So I'm going to be seeing that this weekend. What's your engagement or familiarity thoughts on
yeah,
that?
yeah. Um, well, again, I was born in 1950, which meant I was a teenager during the 60s, and of course that's when a lot of this drug experimentation exploded popularly. And a lot of my friends were smoking marijuana and experimenting with LSD and other psychedelics and so forth. It wasn't handled well in most cases. It was done without supervision. It was done recreationally, and I saw a lot of chaos in my friends' lives that were doing those sorts of things. So I uh, had a pretty negative view, and I certainly didn't see people becoming enlightened. Of course, I wasn't aware of a lot of the experiments that were being done, scientific experiments with psychedelics that had actually uncovered some fascinating things and some potential therapeutic uses and spiritual uses. So in my conversation with Bill, and Bill obviously had been doing some experimenting, and I respect Bill, and I thought, well, okay, I'm going to look into this, So I took his advice. I read the Poland book, How to Change Your Mind. I followed that up with Immortality Key. I followed that up with Huxley's Doors of Perception. Alan Watts had written some stuff on psychedelics. He had actually written some things to government leaders explaining the potential valid spiritual use for psychedelics and demonstrating it was no different than religion in terms of what the objectives were. And there were a few moments that I like to know things for myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was I don't know, there were some weeks where, and I had some friends who were experimenting with psychedelics, and they said, hey, anytime you need anything, let me know. And so I had motive, opportunity. So I'm contemplating, wow, do I do this or not? So I went back and reread the Poland book, this time looking very carefully at the experiences that had been reported, primarily the positive experiences that had been reported by people on psychedelics and the spiritual experiences. And when I finished going through the book again, I sat back and I thought, wow, except for the light show,
Mm-hmm. You already had it all.
I've experienced all these things in meditation. Now, it took me 10 years instead of 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I looked back and I looked at the friends who were experimenting and still experimenting and where they were, and this is going to sound horrible, and where I am or was,
Mm-hmm.
I thought, wow, it took a lot longer for me to experience expanded states of awareness, right? To experience awareness beyond default mode network and so forth. But it happened carefully in an integrated way, no excess, no confusion, and it's resulted in a stable, deep inner spiritual life. So I thought, okay, I probably did this the right way, even in ignorance, the right way. And I just decided there wasn't a need to mess around with the psychedelics because I didn't see anything being offered that I hadn't already
Mm-hmm.
experienced. So then later, when I was reading the Watts letters, there's so much in there that's not anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
These private letters. He finally admitted in a couple of places that even though psychedelics can have benefit in the initial stages of spiritual awakening, in either the prompting of it or the expansion of it, continued use of those substances, in my experience, don't have a positive benefit. That was his ultimate conclusion. And he experimented with several of those, with the Huxley and these other big names at the time. So that I take every opportunity I can, and I have my friends who were experimenting, and I said, return and report. I want to know, what's going on, what you're experiencing, what's the value. And as of yet, nothing's come up. And I'm not seeing what I would call the spiritual stability that I've experienced with my companions in the meditative path, right? So I have no doubt that they can open a person's consciousness and give them a sense for an expanded, deeper reality in a very profound way. Some people, one experience and their lives are changed. It's substantive, it's dramatic. Some people don't experience much. For some people, it's weird. And so, yeah, I'm kind of left with the issue of genuine spiritual awakening, however it's done,
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not limiting people to my way of doing things, versus simply playing with altered states of consciousness. For some, it's a play, right? Ooh, wow! So okay, this could be interesting and fun. When the rubber meets the road, I want genuine spiritual awakening, right?
Mhm.
Not just
So yeah, I think I'd agree with you in some sense and maybe disagree in the others. I think that there is this, this is a difficult, especially for people that have done either through a religious path or meditative path. It's like, you've worked hard, you've climbed up the mountain and you're at the peak. And it is somewhat offensive to be like, what you take that substance and you think that you're getting, the same experience that I get through my like walk with Jesus or through, and I think it is sort of like, if you view it as like a path of a mountain peak, like you can either, if you know the path and you're on it, you can do that way. You can um, climb up it. Other people, they have no clue that there is a path, that there is a peak, and so it's like, hey, here's something that you can do, and it doesn't have to be substances. That like it'll transport you for a few minutes to the
sure.
peak, and
Yes.
you'll see like, hey, that is where I want to be. But you're going to come back down here, like, and that's what this is. It's a tool um, that can give you like an idea of like, oh, that's where it is. This is the path to get there. And sometimes like when I just get so discouraged and like I'm just ready to give up, it's useful to be like, yeah, this is
Mm,
this is what it's about. But it's I do sort of view it as like it's the difference between like putting something on layaway versus putting it on your credit card, is that like you still have to pay the same amount. If you take interest out of it, you still have to pay the same amount, because people do, I have a lot of friends that's been their awakening, is through psychedelics. I have a friend that is a coach and a guide, and like he was hardcore materialist, atheist, no interest in anything spiritual, and it was through psychedelics that
mm.
he's a very kind, loving,
Oh,
spiritual
good.
person. And so, but yeah,
Good.
then there's other people that just takes them further and further into narcissism, because it's they still don't
Right.
want to look at what they don't want to look at. So
Right.
I think that, yeah, there isn't, it's not a free lunch. It's like whether you're paying before you get the lunch or whether you're paying after, or kind of
Oh,
in between. Um, for my experience, it was interesting because again, mine were all uh, endogenous. But then I did have the opportunity. I was on a trip to Amsterdam, and I was like, okay, this is, it's legal. On a try. And it was very interesting. I was like, oh, this is the same exact place, visually and colorful. And I wasn't seeing anything. The endogenous experiences I had, I wasn't seeing anything that wasn't there. It was just a further, more rich, colorful. It's like upgrading your camera. Um, and it was interesting that like that was part of that same experience. And so for me, it was helpful to realize like, yeah, this is a mountain peak. There are different paths that get up there, and they're not necessarily equivalent, but there is some kind of rough area at the top of the mountain that um, people seem to get there through religious practice, through um, meditative practice. But I've also learned too that it's it's like a power tool. It's like a power saw, where some people, they've been in carpentry their whole life and they've been like learning and learning with these non-power tools, and they kind of reach this limit of like, if only I could cut these big pieces quicker and easier, I could do more things. And then they're handed that, and they're able to like skillfully and safely use it, and
mm.
know that you don't have, that's not going to be your finishing touches. It's like you're going to use it when you need to do this, and then you're going to use your hand tools when you need to do that. But then there's other people that like, I've never done carpentry, and I think if I just spend all this money and buy all these things, I'll be this master carpenter. And then they cut their hands off. So I've learned more and more that like there is no inherent morality or goodness, or it's really how they're used. And I think more and more in the studies too, you're seeing that, yeah, there's good and bad outcomes. And actually what seems to be as important as medicine or the substance is the relationship with the guide. And that's being shown in both therapy, but also psychedelic therapy. And so I think that's the key. And with information too, it's interesting because I don't know if you've heard about this, like yoga QAnon pipeline, where there are people that they get into yoga and they get into these things and they get exposed to these ideas, non-human intelligence and whatnot, and that they have all the same information as somebody else that may take a very spiritual and healthy path, but then they end up going into like conspiracy and QAnon and like there's a cabal controlling the world. So it's in some ways the information is just information, but it's in the end it's the intention and how you put it together and what underlying philosophy you're working at that ends up making the difference between where you end up. That's been my thoughts. I initially was more bullish on it all, but then as I've learned and seen that other people's pathways can be very different, I've tried to like get to like what's the underlying principle that seems to be the commonality between people that progress in all these pathways versus, religion, even I think safer meditative pathways. Like there are also people that go in unhealthy ways, which is interesting.
Yeah, again, to me, this, awakening to a larger reality can go a lot of different ways depending on interpretation, as we talked about, or the context in which people are doing this. Both of my key spiritual teachers, and it's part of core of my yoga tradition that in the end it's not about phenomena, it's about the development of character, and I would say Christ-like character, Christ-like nature. And if your for lack of a better word, cosmic or transcendental experiences aren't ultimately bearing the fruit of deeper love, greater kindness, greater compassion, greater respect for creation and life, then something's a little off.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, this awakening to the ultimate reality matters, but then that bears its best fruit in the context of, what we would summarize as Christ-like living, characterized by, mercy, love, compassion, grace, and so forth. I've seen a lot of people with kind of the brain phenomena, but then their life doesn't result in that kind of behavior. So I had a very close friend who was a childhood friend. I hadn't seen him in like 25 years, and I went to visit him, and he'd become quite recluse. And we were talking about it, and then he finally revealed his deep, dark secret. And 20 years earlier, he had had this spontaneous, unplanned, unknown expansion of consciousness. And what he described is normally what would have been described in mystical texts.
Mm-hmm.
And as he's describing, I'm feeling joyfulness and blissfulness because that's my context, right? And when he got done telling the story, which I thought was going to be a happy ending, he said his conclusion was that he had had a psychotic breakdown and that there was something wrong with him, and he was now afraid of himself and his own mind, and he'd become a recluse.
Yeah.
So I tried to recontextualize his experience in a very positive way. I said, good Lord, you got this in 10 seconds. It's taken me 20 years of practice. Wow. I think it was helpful to him.
Yeah. And I think that is part of this difficulty, especially with how wayward Western psychology is, where it's all about psychopathology. And there's really not, there's the positive psychology thing, but it's like, there's just, if you have these experiences, it's either psychoses or you're religious. Like there's really
That's right.
there's no middle ground. It's starting to open up a bit. I mean,
Yeah.
Alan Watts talks about this as like, in the West, if you wake up and say like, I'm Jesus, they'll throw you in, an
Right.
institution. In the East, if you wake up, they'll be like, what took you so long to figure out? So yeah, I can relate to that because when I was having these experiences, not knowing what was going on, and again, I wasn't seeing things that weren't there, but
Right.
it was such a fundamentally different reality than I had ever experienced that I'm like, I'm either crazy. You either think you're crazy or you're God initially. And this is like Carl Jung talks about, like when you're going, his book on Kundalini yoga, he's like, you start to open up to the impersonal, and he's like,
Right.
don't identify with it. Like you have to stay, keep with your ego to somewhat. Luckily, I had a friend, actually, a roommate from BYU who had left Mormonism, gotten into psychedelics and Burning Man and energy work and whatnot. And he was like, oh, like you should look up Kundalini Awakening. Like you should, he was able to guide me through all these things that, like, without that, I definitely, it's a knife edge, and I could have seen it going another way where you're like, you worry that you're crazy. Other people that don't have the capacity or the understanding, like, may tell you that, and then you either become reclusive or you double down into like, um yeah. So I see a lot of that, I think, in Joseph Smith and the history of, like, especially I read King Follett's discourse recently about, well, I think there is a lot of true intention there, but it's a very deeply tortured person that I see, where it's like he's shifting back and forth between, like, I love my fellow man, I've never done anything to hurt anybody else, and um, but it's very, like, you see this very splitting, and
Yeah.
it's he's giving a sermon or a speech, but you really see his psyche going on, trying to convince himself, like, what I've done is right. I haven't hurt people. I haven't. Um, so I can relate to that, and I think that's one of, I think, the benefits of this psychedelic, and just collective spiritual awakening, is that as these things come up, and with the internet, there's support groups and there's people that can help guide and integrate, so that you can have what would have been a bad outcome actually end up be a very beautiful,
Mm.
transformative experience. There's
Yeah.
one last thought, and then I'll let you go. One of the things that seems to be like this integral pathway, that I guess a fork in the road that you have to go back. Because I originally thought, like, oh, like, I had this mystical experience, it really helped me. Anybody that had this, like, they'll get it. But what I seem to see is that there are a lot of people that had this, but then they still contextualized it within this duality of God and Satan, good and evil. And then they
Yes.
kind of double down into, like, we need to really vanquish evil, and like these, they get really obsessed with, good things like fighting sex trafficking or something, but it's just like this. And I think it comes back to the inner self-worth and shame, but that seems to be this very difficult thing to unwind, is like, how do you integrate good and evil, and how do you shift from, like, Christ being the savior to Christ being a way shower? um, that seems to be a sticking point between what direction you go. What are your thoughts and experience with
Yeah. So I'd say in the past 10, 12 years, in my experience, and one person can only have so much experience, but um, I've interacted with a lot of what I call second coming groups, Armageddon groups or second comforter groups. And I get involved with them because they invite me to come and do meditation
Mhm.
seminars, and then I get the missionary discussion on what they're about.
Mhm.
Um, and I've had a number of friends who are no longer my friends, because I wouldn't support what they were doing. But um, Mormon, in general, many Mormons are so desperate for mystical spiritual experience genuine mystical spiritual experience, that they'll go to odd extremes to feel that they're having it, or that they're participating in something where the leader has had this. They believe in the person, and then they hope they're going to have the experience. So somebody will say, Jesus has appeared to me. Oh, gee, well, and Jesus can appear to you. Oh, well, I'm going to be a part of this group, right? And then they live in this fever and frustration of having some sort of imagined physical appearance of Jesus coming to them. Or they're suddenly part of a group that's getting a higher revelation, and this group is going to do some special things that are going to either hasten or bring about this classic second coming of Jesus, to destroy things and set up his kingdom. It's a weird blend of a revelation or mystical point of view with the standard theology, right?
Mm-hmm.
The standard view of Jesus coming again to destroy the wicked and set up his kingdom. And the excess and the craziness. And so I've had several people being presented to me as people who have had Jesus appear to them, right? Well, okay, I'll take that seriously. I'll read, I'll listen. But then they follow that by describing Jesus in such a way that's completely contrary to his nature and character.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells me whatever happened, and I don't know what happened, whatever happened, drugs, vision, self-deception, active imagination, fantasy, I don't know. But the one thing I do know is that they don't know Christ, because his true nature and character is lost in all of that, and the things they're doing don't reflect that. And so many of these folks envision faith as doing something that violates their character or conscience or faith, or it's got to be some sort of Abrahamic test. So they'll give up their family, or they'll give up something they've spent a lot of time and money on that's important to them. Oh, God revealed to me I have to surrender this and donate it to somebody
Mm-hmm.
else for nothing. Something they've worked on for 20 or 30 years that matters. God's requiring that of me. And it's like, wow, it's the same God, right? Dysfunctional parent,
Mm-hmm.
testing, punishing, in a supposedly revelatory or mystical context, and it's all nuts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the combination's nutty.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of light bulb went off for me when, I don't know if it was Hiram Smith or one of these early church leaders. I was reading their account of just how like distraught and beside themselves they were when Joseph Smith approached them and said, "Hey, you're called to like practice polygamy," and whether it was they were going to take another wife or whether he was going to take their wife or something. But like they said, like, I didn't sleep for days, I didn't eat for days, and then I had this beautiful outpouring of love. And I'm like, that is the recipe for a mystical experience, is like pushing your body to the extreme physiologically. And I also think I see it in
And
these group
psychologically.
true. Yeah. So I think these kind of left-hand path sort of things where you like initiate these experiences through psychologically pushing yourself to the brink. I do see, for me, I think a lot of these, I validate that I bet a lot of these people are having experiences. I just don't agree with the interpretation. And it's kind of funny because
Yeah.
if you look back at like Joseph Smith, kind of what he taught from beginning to the end, he said he saw a being that you later find out lives on Kolob or near Kolob and is like around other beings that have gained this. If you put King Follett's discourse with the first vision, he had some being appear to him from somewhere out in space that told him like, "Hey, I'm responsible for this whole planet and you guys, but not necessarily everybody." And it's much more similar to like these alien abduction stories. And I think there is some truth there too. If you look into like the research on these people that have, abduction experiences, they're having some experience, but it's not necessarily mystical and it's not integrated and it becomes traumatic for most. Although there are ones that are like, these aliens loved me and everything. So it is interesting to see. It's like there is an experience. Sometimes it's a mystical one. Sometimes it ends up in pathology. If you're religious, it kind of gets filtered through this. And if you're
Right.
not, it can get filtered through mythology. And so it's interesting to see the overlap. And even with Jesus, like I've connected much more with like Jesus and Christ as an archetype, but I can also see that people from like a Hindu or other path, can connect with the same archetype without any knowledge of like a historical,
Sure.
the same things are there, but they present differently. So yeah, any closing thoughts? I enjoy the
Oh, no
discussion,
problem.
and
No.
especially I like, our different paths, and I find for me this is helpful in my own integration is when I see two people talking about the same thing from different ways. Any final thoughts or, I guess, advice?
Well, for me, if I had to summarize all this, for me, I find yoga and Jesus uh, being the best communicators of the perennial philosophy for me. And I return to that over and over because to me it is the core spiritual realization that beneath this world of form, there's an infinite, changeless, formless reality. Our essence is that. And that when we awaken to that, an integration of the domains of the universal and the personal, or spirit and matter, whatever language you want to use, in the integration of that, the full purpose of life is fulfilled. And there's that verse I'm not as kind to Joseph Smith as some are these days, but that verse in the Doctrine and Covenants that, matter and element and spirit inseparably connected receives a fullness of joy. Bam.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we join the world, the foundational reality of the formless, consciousness, existence, being / God spirit, with the creation, that formless reality manifesting into this wonderful variety of forms that has an infinite array of expressions, and we're able to live in the stability of the eternal, but be a part of this infinite expansion of the creative and expression of the divine in so many different ways. It is joyful. It's interesting. It's exciting. And you do feel, my wife likes this phrase of co-creating with God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of our feeling. We want to abide in God. We want God to abide in us. And then out of that abiding, we want to create between us and around us a unique expression of the divine. And in the end, I judge those things based on, I just judge the goodness of things or the healthiness of things based on the nature and character of God as I've experienced it, and by what we generally refer to as Christ-like love and nature and being. And that's just working really well for us. And the rest, we deal with as it arises. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, as it's funny because I've been able to go back and find so much more meaning in the New Testament than I ever did before, because now the parts that do align with this pop out, and then the other parts are like, whoever wrote this probably didn't get it. Like I think John 17 and like this literal teaching that like be one as I am with the Father. Like I think that, to me, it does end up being all about love. Like when you kind of take Satan out of the picture or recontextualize evil as just like the forgetting or the lack of knowledge of this oneness, it does become about love. And it is like all the law and the prophets, hang on, like loving God and loving your neighbor because God is your neighbor. And like that does serve as the core of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent the last 3 years, or go back 6 months, the 3 years prior to that, deeply immersed in New Testament studies and Jesus studies. I tried to read all the major scholars and authors on all sides of this. And I just came to the conclusion that, and you see it in the Gospel of Mark, which is so interesting. In Mark, he's portraying the disciples as never getting it, obtuse, dense, not understanding. I don't know that I accept that, because I believe that Jesus is going to choose people who are going to get it and who are going to be able to share it. So I've come to the conclusion that it was Mark's way of saying, we're 50 years past Jesus now, and the disciples aren't getting it, not the original disciples, but the church is losing the message and the mission and the true mediation of Jesus. And as a result of that, things are going badly. And his gospel ends in fear. It doesn't end with glorious resurrection and happiness and joy. And as I read the Gospels now, it's just so obvious to me where later understandings of Jesus being interpreted back in some of the old Jewish models of sacrifice and redemption were being imposed back onto Jesus, because the stuff that comes out of Jesus's mouth are not harmonious. And so I feel like, arrogantly, generally I can discern what was more likely an accurate saying of Jesus and what was imposed with an agenda from 50, 60, 70, 80 years later. And then, the author of John, knowing the mystical aspect, trying to somehow reintegrate that into the story of Jesus. So this is all exciting stuff. And it's at the core of our life purpose. So,
and I do I deeply resonate with what you're talking about. I was just talking to a friend the other day. For me, it's this balance of peak experience, transcendent experience. It's both understanding the goal isn't to just bliss out when you're on the cushion, or go to some retreat and just remove yourself from society. It's to be able to integrate that and bleed that into your reality. That the kingdom of heaven is at hand if you can see it. And then at the same time too, I've also learned to have some compassion for those experiences are great, and I can seek for them as long as I'm balancing for an integration. I think that's because there are people that are nope, it's not about those, don't seek those things. I think it's both. I think there is some aspect of, I find myself getting so stuck into psychology and it's healing, it's trauma, I need to do this, and I forget about playing. And it is fun to explore different consciousness, whether even it's just endogenously, is the connection with people. It's a different state of consciousness. Depression is a different state of consciousness. We can expand our palette to be able to think and be more integrative and loving. And I think that's the goal, is to integrate it, our own consciousnesses, our own minds, as well as part of the God mind of others. And
yeah, well, I'll end with the scripture you made reference to, and it's translated differently, and depending on the translation, the kingdom of God is within you, or the kingdom of God is among you. That Greek word entos can be translated either way, which was probably inspired. Most Bible translators now, and LDS included, like among you, because it makes no sense to say the kingdom is within. Well, that's the Eastern experience, right? Well, both are true.
Yeah.
For me, I awaken to the kingdom within me. I start to see that it's not just within me, it's among me, and that this kingdom within me is intended to be integrated among me. So now I can more consciously live in, rejoice in, and share that kingdom that is among us. It's not meant. You're not meant to be sitting in a cave by yourself. You're meant to be as Jesus did, right? He goes off by himself to pray, right? In the closet to the hidden secret God, which are all code words for awakening in deep prayer or meditation. And then once he's established in that, boom, he is out among all levels of society, blessing, healing, teaching, lifting. Yeah. So
And it's been bizarre too. I mean, this is where like idealism, which is a conversation for another day, like really is powerful rather than an objective material world, is that when you do awaken, when you do start to reprogram and like resolve your traumas, it is bizarre that the reality that you experience in your life and in your interactions and the people that you see, it does start to change and it becomes a different, I think it's like a different layer of reality where you're like, suddenly everybody seems more healed and everybody seems more loving. And it's interesting when you're kind of swinging from some of these, I think in the more chaotic, it is bizarre to like go to the airport one day and you're kind of in this like lower realm and like all the TSA agents, so like you're like, ah, they don't care about me. And like, and then like you go in another like consciousness where you're just kind of blissed out of like, ah, everything's love. And for some reason, all the TSA agents that are working that day, they're smiling at you. And it's like, this isn't just a coincidence of like what shift, like you do start to see your relationships, your job, yourself, like things, the world, nature around you slowly starts to shift. And it's kind of imperceptible at times, but you can look back and be like, oh, I'm living a different reality than I did 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Yep.
So, well, thanks so much, Phil.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'll put a link to some of your pieces in the show notes.